Hello everyone, this is Molton and welcome back to my channel. In this episode I want to share with you guys two methods which I've learned on how to deal with the 4 knights old bishop e5 Spanish variation. One method is a very solid option which I've learned to play for quite a long time, and the second method is a trickier and trendier option at the moment, so stay tuned to find out what they are. If you enjoyed the content, remember to drop a like and subscribe if you want to see more weekly chess videos, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Okay, so the old Spanish starts after e4, e5, and both players bring out both knights. And then white plays the move bishop e5 here. Here we have two options in this position which I recommend, starting with probably the simpler one to play, which is bishop e4. Here white should castle, we can castle, and white should play the move d3. Since we're not worried about bishop takes c6, we can always answer with the move d takes c6. And white can never take the pawn on e5 because he will lose the pawn on e4. So after d3, the simplest move which I recommend in this position is just to chop that knight off the board and go bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, and play the move d6. Here we've given up our bishop pair to give white the double pawns, and we have a very solid pawn structure. The only thing we have to worry about in this position is the bishop coming out to g5. So we need to know a maneuver in this position to try and get rid of it. So for example, if the bishop comes out to g5 immediately, we should play this maneuver starting with the move queen e7, vacating the d8 square for our knight. So for example, after the move rook e1, we can play knight d8, and after the move say d4, we can play knight to e6, attacking the bishop on g5. The bishop should drop back to either h4 or c1. If it goes to h4, then we can play the move knight f4, and we're going to drop the knight back to g6 and hit the bishop, so white can't maintain this pin forever. If white goes bishop c1, then the best response, in my opinion, is to play the move c5 here, trying to block up the position. Since black has a dark squared bishop, we can try to put our pawns on dark squares to limit the scope of this bishop. And also, since we have the two knights, we want to keep the position as closed as possible. We also set up a mini trap here in this position, since if white decides to take the pawn on e5, we can play the move knight c7, attacking the knight on e5 and the bishop on b5, winning a free piece. So white has a few other options in this position, and another option we can look at is the move rook e1. Against this, again, you can play queen e7 and get a very similar position to what we looked at. Or you have other options, such as bishop d7, which is also perfectly playable, and you can also play the move knight e7 here, which is also a very good and solid alternative. The idea being to put the knight on g6, and then you can follow up with either c6 or c5, and then your pieces develop very harmoniously without any issues. Okay, that's it for the first method, so I'm going to show you the second method next. Now I'll show you guys the second method you can use to play in this position, and it starts out with the move knight d4. The best move for white is probably a retreat with the bishop, but we'll look at the alternatives first. Starting with knight takes knight, pawn takes. If white tries to play the move e5 here, we can take the knight. And we don't have to take the pawn on d2 here because white gets quite a bit of compensation, so we can just take the pawn on f6. And after pawn takes, well, clearly black has no problems in this position and we're perfectly fine. Another option for white might be to take the pawn on e5. After this, we should reply queen e7. And if white retreats to f3, the simplest way to play is simply to take the bishop. After knight takes, just go queen takes e4. essentially forcing a queen trade already. If white goes king f1, we can still force the queen trade if we want by playing queen to c4 and getting the same position. Here white's attacking the pawn on c7, so we should defend it. And the best way to do so is to play knight to d5. Here, if white plays c4, then we'll respond with the move a6, counterattacking the knight on b5. If white tries to move rook e1 to try and get some discovered check along the e-file, then the best move for black is to play f6. Since we don't want the king on d8, because we might run into knight attacks on the king side, we want to put our king on f7 instead. For example, if king f1, we can simply follow up with king f7, and if c4 here, we can play a6, counterattacking the knight with a great position for black, since we have the two bishops and a lot of squares to go for on the queen side. Therefore, another move here for white is the move bishop a4. After this one, the simplest response, in my opinion, is simply to take the knight on f3 and then play the move bishop to c5. Here, white should probably castle, but I can quickly point out that if white tries to play the move queen g3, attacking the pawn on g7 and e5, then we can simply respond with the move castles. And white can't in fact take the pawn on e5, since we have a nice response here with the move bishop takes f2 check, forcing the king to move, since the king can't take the bishop because of this knight fork on g4. Therefore, white can just castle here instead, and I suggest black can just play the move c6 here, and after the move d3, for example, we can just play d6, and black doesn't have any problems in this position, and our piece development is quite easy. For example, if white plays bishop g5 here, we're not worried about this pin either. We can just play the move h6. If the bishop goes to h4, we can even follow up with g5, since our king is not yet castled. If white takes it, then we can just take back, and the double pawns don't really cause any problems for black because we've managed to swap off queens and we maintain the bishop pair. And we can also get rid of the pawn by playing f5 at any point. So black has a very good position here. Therefore here in this position, I think the best response for white is to go bishop c4. After this, black can play the move bishop c5, tempting white to take the pawn on e5, which leads to very complicated lines. If white doesn't take the pawn on e5 and plays any other move, say castles, I think black can just play d6, and these positions are relatively okay. We don't really have any major issues here. Therefore, we'll be focusing on the move knight takes e5 instead. After this, we can play the move queen e7, not defending our f7 pawn because we have some tactics if white takes it. For example, if bishop takes f7, we can reply with king f8, and we're winning a piece in this position because the knight and bishop are both being attacked. For example, f4 runs into d6, and we win a piece. If white takes the pawn on f7 with the knight, then we can counterattack with the move d5 in the center, blocking the bishop's defense of the knight on f7. Now if white takes the rook, then we can take the bishop. And for example, in this position, we will win the knight on h8 back and get a very good position. Say d6, bishop e6, castles, and yeah, this knight is trapped, and we'll get two pieces for the rook with a perfectly fine position for black. Also, obviously, if bishop takes here, we can go knight takes, and the knight on f7 is undefended. Therefore, usually here, white will retreat the knight back to f3. And here we can follow up with the active move d5 in the center, utilizing the pin along the e-file. So for example, White can take with the knight or the bishop. The bishop's the most popular capture, but if knight takes, we can simply go queen takes e4, and if knight e3, we can simply follow up with bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3, which is forcing the move bishop e2, and at very worst we can simply just take here and then castles queenside. And I think black has full compensation in this position for the sacrificed pawn. We have a very active position and two bishops as well. Therefore white usually takes back with the bishop, and here the best move for black is to play the move bishop to g4, pinning the knight on f3. White should reply with d3, but if white goes bishop takes b7, then we can follow up with rook b8, and if white plays the move bishop a6 here, we can play the move knight takes e4, and if castles, we can follow up with bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3, and a move knight g5 here, which is winning since white can't pin us along the e file due to knight f3 checks, and we're also threatening, for example, after king h1, knight takes f3, we're threatening to play queen d6 here, forking the h2 pawn and the bishop on a6, with a winning position for black. If white decides to castle instead here, then we can play the move c6 to kick the bishop back to b3, and then the move knight to d7. Since the bishop is way on b3, we can continue to attack the knight on f3, and white doesn't have enough pieces to defend, and he can't unpin either. So eventually we're going to break through after we play the knight into e5 next move, with a winning position as well. Therefore, if he can't take the pawn and he can't castle, what's the best move for white? So the best move is d3 in this position. And after d3, we continue in our very active style of play, and we play the move castles queenside. Now we're utilizing the pin again, and we're attacking the bishop on d5 with our rook. So we're threatening to win a piece in this position. So white should do something about this. Now white has two ways to try and defend this bishop on d5. One's bishop e3 and another one is bishop b3. Unfortunately, this one runs into some very nice tactics, starting with a huge move in this position, knight takes e4, completely blowing up the center. For example, if white takes back with the pawn, then we have the nice move knight takes f3, simply winning a queen here. For example, pawn takes, we can just take the queen on d1. Therefore, white should reply with knight takes. After this, we have the move f5. And then the position can get a little bit tricky, but the tactics are favoring black. For example, bishop g5, we can play the move queen e8, maintaining the pin along the e file. And if white tries to take the rook, then we can take the knight on e4. And at the same time, we're attacking the knight on f3. So eventually we're going to take on f3 with a big attack. For example, takes, queen takes e4. And if king f1, we can simply just take the bishop for now, since we still have the pin along the bishop and queen. And black has a winning position here. So the main move white will play in this position is the move bishop to e3. After this, we should play very actively as black, since we've sacrificed two pawns already, so we don't want white to fully consolidate his position. So we need to start out with the move knight takes d5. And here, white should play knight takes d5, but if pawn takes d5, then the easiest way to play is simply to chop off this knight and then play knight f5 with a positionally one position, because white's pawn structure is completely damaged, and we're just going to start winning all the pawns back. Therefore, after knight takes d5, here again we're not going to move our queen. We're going to play very actively, and we're going to sacrifice an exchange in this position with the move rook takes d5. White is obliged to take it, and now we get into a series of relatively forced moves for both sides. Black starts out with the move rook e8, and white has two options, main options in this position. So we'll take a look at both. If he plays anything other than these options, I think he'll end up with a worse position. So the first option he can start out with is the move castles kingside. So after this, black should follow with the move bishop takes knight, and after pawn takes bishop, we can play the move either bishop d6 or queen to h4, both leading to the same thing. So for example, bishop d6, here he can't take our knight because after queen h4, we're gonna win the bishop back, or also checkmate on h2. Here the best move for white is to play f4, and then we should play queen h4, and the resulting moves should all end in perpetual checks. But if white chooses to play for more, then it can be quite dangerous. For example, king h1, this was a game played by Rajabov against Mortlaev. Rajabov played queen h3 in this position, threatening to play knight f3 next move. If bishop takes, then bishop f4 is winning. So rook g1 was played, and after knight f3, rook g2, Rajabov played g5, getting some attack on the king side and some initiative. So it's very difficult for white to play this position. Rajabov went on to win a very nice game. Therefore, if we go back to this position, other moves have been played, but they all ended up in perpetual checks. The first move was king g2, where black played knight takes pawn, queen takes, and then there's just perpetual check with the queen here. So this is a draw. Another way to get a draw here is to play the move. Another way to get a draw here is to play the move bishop takes d4. After this, black should play the move bishop takes f4. We have to be careful not to play queen takes f4 here, because then queen h5 is winning, because it defends the h2 square. So after bishop takes f4, the white king should go to g2 to avoid checkmate. And here, because we're a rook down, we have to take the perpetual check. And we can do so by sacking the bishop as well, and then constant checks on these squares. And there's no way for white to avoid the perpetual from the queen. So the final position should be a draw. Okay, so in this position, white can also play the move c3, after which we should reply knight takes f3 check, pawn takes, and then instead of moving our bishop or taking the bishop on e3, a very good move for black here is queen to h4, creating some very dangerous threats. Now the best move for white is to run with the king with king d2, but there's a very nice variation here. If white takes the bishop on g4, we can actually go rook takes e3 check. If the king goes to d2 here, we can just take the pawn and then play rook e2 with a winning attack. But if he actually goes king f1, then we actually have a very nice checkmate in 4 in this position. If you want to work it out, I'll give you a few seconds to pause the video. Okay, so the checkmate in this position starts with queen h3 check. The king has to go to g1, and then the nice move in this position is rook to g3, utilizing the pin of the king by the bishop on c5. And after pawn takes, queen queen takes f2 is checkmate. A very nice finish in this position. Therefore, the best move for white in this position after queen h4 is to go king d2, and now we get a series of forced moves for both sides. They're just the best moves in the position, and the result is it's going to end in like a perpetual check. But there's a lot of room for both players to go wrong if they get any of the moves inaccurate during a game. So the first nice move here is rook takes e3. If they take the bishop, then queen takes f2 will lead to a transposition to one of the positions we just looked at. Therefore, white should play pawn takes rook, and we follow up with queen takes f2 check. So we've given up two exchanges in this position, but the white king is being chased around, and for the time being, as long as the rooks can't get connected, we have an attack. The king should go to c1, and then here we should follow up with the move bishop takes f3, attacking the queen and rook. The only move for white here is queen to e1, and after queen e1 we go bishop takes e3. The king is forced to b1. Here we take the rook, forcing queen takes bishop, and here we play queen e2, attacking the pawn on d3, and that's also threatening checkmate. So white's next move is also forced since he can't play queen e4 because of his back rank. He has to either play a3 or a4. So after a4, for example, we should take the pawn, and after king to a2 we can go queen c4 check, king b1, and then, well, the best move here is just to continually check, because we can't let white bring the rook into the game, because then we're at risk of losing this position. So a few of these lines ended up in perpetual checks and long draws. So if you're unhappy with that in any way, then I would suggest you play the first method where there's a lot more scope for play. But I think the second method is also very good because there's a lot of ways for your opponent to go wrong, and they really have to navigate their way through this long variation if they want to make the perpetual checks and draws. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed these videos, and I'll catch you next time on next video. Later.